Hello, everyone, and welcome to LA LOUVER. We're pleased to have you all here. This is our first event in over 2 years, and it feels really good. It feels wonderful to not only have this extraordinary show that's been curated by Alison Saar, 9 artists in a show called SeenUnseen that are spirit portraits in many different guises, in every media, and we've had a remarkable, wonderful reception to this, and we wanted to have some additional events that would strengthen the, just the focus of the exhibition itself, and we have other things that are planned beyond this, but the first thing that Alison wanted to do was do a reading with Myriam Chancy, so we are honored to have her here with us for this today. And because it becomes a literary event, and this is Venice, we were able to partner with Beyond Baroque. And this is Quentin Ring, who's the director of the programs there. He's kept a very lively program going, and for any of you who don't know about Beyond Baroque, he will give you a small introduction. LA LOUVER is about to celebrate its 47th year here in Venice. It's an amazing accomplishment. We've survived through these crazy times for all of us and are very pleased to still be a part of this community. So, without further ado, here is Quentin, who will introduce Myriam, and Alison Saar, I hope, will need no introduction.
Great, thank you, Kimberly, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm not used to being back in person, so I still have some notes. Oh, the mic is actually working. Okay, I'm sorry. So yeah, good afternoon, everyone. As Kimberly said, my name is Quentin Ring, and I am the director of Beyond Baroque Literary Arts Center. For those of you who don't know, we are located just up Venice Boulevard from LA LOUVER in the old Venice City Hall. I just want to say it's a real pleasure and honor to be here at LA LOUVER. Our two organizations are really landmark Venice arts institutions, and we have a relationship that goes back decades. So I just really want to say thank you to everyone at LA LOUVER, but especially Kimberly, Lisa, and Ashley for having us here today. I also wanted to thank everyone in the audience. This is very much a fundraiser for Haitian earthquake relief efforts, and I'm grateful to everyone who purchased a ticket because these funds will go directly to the nonprofit Focal for their efforts on behalf of victims of the earthquake. For those of you who don't know too much about Beyond Baroque, we are Los Angeles' oldest literary institution. We're dedicated to the artistic possibilities of language through cultivating new writing, presenting contemporary literature and art, and building a diverse literary community. Our programs include writing workshops, literary readings, multidisciplinary performances, and art exhibitions. And over the years, we've nurtured the careers of poets ranging from Wanda Coleman and artists such as Mike Kelly to the country's youngest ever U.S. inaugural poet, Amanda Gorman. This is our final program of the year, but I am happy to announce we will be reopening for in-person programming on January 29th. So I do hope that some of you will come and check out our space, go to a reading, go to art exhibits, check out our bookstore, and generally sort of come back to in-person programming. We do have a long history of exploring the intersection of the literary and visual arts, and that's why I'm particularly glad to be here to co-present a reading and conversation with two greats, one from the literary world and one from the visual arts, Myriam J.A. Chancy and Alison Saar. It's especially a treat to present this in tandem with this really wonderful exhibit that you see around you, and I'm very much looking forward to the conversation with Myriam and Alison. So just to get started, I'd like to say a few words about Myriam, and then she'll read for you and I think introduce Alison as well, and then we'll move on to the conversation. Myriam J.A. Chancy's novel on the 2010 Haiti earthquake, What Storm, What Thunder, was published in fall 2020 by HarperCollins Canada, Tin House in the USA. She is a Guggenheim Fellow and Hartley Burr Alexander Chair of the Humanities at the Scripps College of the Claremont Colleges. In addition to What Storm, What Thunder, she is the author of the novels Spirit of Haiti, The Loneliness of Angels, and The Scorpion's Claw. She was awarded the 2011 Guyana Prize in Literature Caribbean Award for Best Fiction for The Loneliness of Angels. She also garnered a short listing for Best First Book in the Canada Caribbean region category of the Commonwealth Prize in 2004 for The Spirit of Haiti. All her novels are taught at universities and colleges in the US, Canada, and the Caribbean. I'm very pleased to have Myriam here today to read from her most recent novel, What Storm, What Thunder. It's a stunning book. We do have copies for sale from Jimmy over here onto the side of the gallery, so I hope you'll pick one up if you don't have one already. So without further ado, everyone, please welcome Myriam J.A. Chancy.
Thank you for that introduction, and I want to thank Alison and everyone at the gallery for inviting me to be part of a conversation with Alison. And I will start with a reading, but I wanted to say thank you first, and also to give you a little bit of information about Focal, which this reading will benefit. Focal is run by Michel Pierre-Louis in Port-au-Prince, Haiti. It is a cultural organization that has been dedicated to uplifting local Haitians for a very long time. So their work hasn't just started with the last two earthquakes. But in so doing, what they've done is really partnered with people on the ground. So in the arts, in culture, in terms of education, in terms of finding people professions when they have been able to get the education that they were seeking with the help of Focal. And so they are really a kind of all-encompassing arts program. They have, I think they purchased the Catherine Dunham's old property, which is part of a park that they are putting together called Parc Martissant. And the property, the Dunham property, which used to be a resort, is being turned into a school, which will teach things like the healing arts, Haitian healing arts, which I see some reflection of in a lot of the pieces in the gallery today. So it will be amazing when that is off the ground. They also have a program putting together libraries, not only in Port-au-Prince, but throughout the Southern Peninsula. So if you've had an occasion to go on their website, which I think is fokal.com, they've talked about some of those libraries being destroyed in the most recent earthquake, which took place in August, and efforts that they have now to rebuild those libraries. So whatever you donate today, I'm sure is going to go directly to rebuilding those libraries and continuing their arts programs throughout the Southern Peninsula first. And so if you go on their website, they'll also give you information about where they're putting those funds. They're very transparent. And this is also part of the message, not only of Focal, but I think of my novel, which is that when we dedicate ourselves to places like Haiti, we really need to partner with people on the ground and know more about their firsthand experience. And this is where the novel has come from. So I'm going to begin by reading from a section of a novel which is narrated by an older woman, 75-year-old woman, who is a market woman named Malou. And for those of you who've not read the novel yet, what you'll find is that the novel is told through 10 narrative voices who all have a very different vantage point because of their age, their gender, sexuality, whether they're wealthy or not wealthy, and how they experience the earthquake is mitigated by those identity markers. And I wanted to do that because I wanted to humanize the experience of the earthquake, but also to give the reader a sense of how varied the responses and experiences of the earthquake were. So two of the characters are outside of Haiti, or part of the Haitian diaspora, and experienced the earthquake from the outside, as I did, and others are right there on the ground experiencing it, depending on where they were in the city or in the vicinity. And I'll just say that I chose Malou as the sort of cornerstone of a novel, so she begins and ends the novel. She's the only narrative voice that repeats, Because often when you see images of Haiti, you will see images of market women, who hold up everything, who are working night and day. But seldom, I think, do you come across a narrative about the market woman or asking the market woman what she thinks should come next. But market women, if you've ever been to the Caribbean or even, farmers markets here, market people know everything usually about the society. They come across everyone from the upper strata to the lower strata, and they are able to make decisions about their own businesses because they understand things beyond their social sphere. And so this is why my Lou is so important. So I'll begin there, and then I think we'll start conversation. Does that sound good? All right. And I've never done a reading with a mic, so we'll see how this goes. Although I've been teaching with all kinds of interesting things this semester. Amplifiers and... Okay. I watched. That's what old market women do. We watch. But this time, the lot of us market women sprang to action, even as our bones creaked for lack of cartilage and oil. Like the others on the street, we used anything in hand we could find. Useless things like spoons and forks, the metal ends of umbrellas, as if our puny things, our fingernails, could move all that. Only the lucky were saved. Being lucky meant simply that you were closer to the surface or that fewer things blocked the way to being found. We heard people on their cell phones all up and down the street, begging frantically for help, giving directions to where they thought they were beneath the rubble, within the rooms of their houses. Phones rang, and we heard people answer them. Then fewer and fewer voices. The tinny, persistent ringing of cell phone tones, different songs rising like wind from underground with no answer. We heard our own voices screaming at each other, asking for help, not knowing what to do. Faces covered with dust and sweat and other things later to be determined what to do. There was nothing to do but to scream, try anything, flail our hands, scratch at the earth like my chickens when they get confused because their fresh-laid eggs disappear one by one, and still they lay more. Try anything, and still it's too little. After the earth rose and split open, yes, I saw angels walking, but there had also been dust, white dust, everywhere, caking all objects and every moving thing. The dust came from the concrete, crumbling to pieces as buildings flattened, but there were also other things mixed in, blood and bones. Had I mistaken the walking dead for angels, survivors stumbling through the debris with the same white flakes covering their bodies from head to toe that covered mine? Eventually, we, the market women, remembered our oil lamps and lit them one by one, those of us who could. Only part of a market had been crushed, the part against a wall. Still, it was impossible to tell what belonged to whom, and at that point, no one cared. We worked at freeing those we could, said prayers for the others, promising deliverance to those we could not get to give them some solace, some hope in their final moments, because salvation would soon be theirs. Then back down the street, darting back and forth, using the goods from the market to feed those working at rescue, doing what we could, as we always did, our large bodies moving through the rubble as if we were land whales, made for swimming through dust-laden air, made for parting human waves. We treated everyone alike. They had become all the same, were always the same, something we had always known from our low-to-the-ground perches, observing life like budgies, our heads wrapped in colorful scarves to keep the heat of the sun from roasting our brains, sweat slipping down our necks, draping the half-moon of our chests exposed above the breasts. We fanned ourselves, but it didn't help. Shallah! Heat came with the territory, but not this. not this, a different kind of heat. Sitting here under the hot sun all day, we ripen. The saints, the crooks, the foreigners, the white saviors, the bleeding hearts, they all need sustenance, and we give it to them. Close my eyes, look away, it's all the same. The need to shut everything down, slow my breathing, take in what's there to take in, let all the rest go. If only I could get rid of the images, of the smells still clogging my nostrils. You would think that after so many years working in the market, nothing would offend this nose. Look what surrounds us every day. The mounds of smoldering garbage, the spoiling fruits with skins speckled with loitering flies, the leavings of dogs, the runoff of dirty water, weaving its way through the alleyways, that dense, acrid stink of urine. A marketplace is a world of colliding senses, not all of it pretty or fruitful, much of it decay, especially at the end of a day when the best of what's available is gone and all that remains are cast-offs, the leftovers. This is the part of a day when those of us who work the market blend into the dust and the loam, become one with the elements, the odors of sweat and dung, the sweet sap of fleshy fruits ground underfoot, the nothing that we are, the all. We sweep up what's left of a day, knowing that striving toward perfection is beyond our reach. A little corner of peace, that's all we want. I found mine after the trip to the waterfalls, but it would take some time to get there. Peace is what others want from me, from us, the market women they imagine sit immobile, rooted to the earth, but without extensions, no lives and families of our own, waiting patiently for them to come with their grimy dollars, for smiles full of need, to unload money and stories of desire, a desire to be free of worry, to be freed. A little corner of peace is all they want, and I give it to them. Thank you.
Yeah, I love that you kind of start with Malu and end with her, and that the marketplace kind of feels like this sort of heart of Haiti, and that everyone passes through it, from all, those of a kind of, in the upper echelon, they're still coming through or sending their housekeepers through. So it's kind of interesting that this is territory that everyone has to set foot on. Yeah, so I guess when I first heard about your book and when I first met you was at a symposium at Pomona College that was looking at the arts in Haiti and how, it's affected, or how Haiti has kind of seeped into people outside of it as well as expats and stuff like that. And you had read one section from, I think it's Sarah's voice, and was that in 2019?
Actually, I think it was 2016, spring 2016. I've been working that long on this book.
Working on it for a while. And
it was a while ago.
I wonder if she's got that book finished. I want to know what else happened after that.
Yeah.
But you had read this one section, and it was just so haunting, just really, really incredibly beautiful. And so when I was curating the show, it was kind of dealing with the spirit and sort of the prevalence of spirit, the African transatlantic spirit that is both in both Haiti and Brazil, South America and the Americas, that it just really felt fitting to kind of invite you to share this. And then I think I had actually written you an email and was ready to send it when I heard you on NPR. I'm like, oh, it is finished. Great. Okay, I can now find out how it ends. But yeah, I wondered if you would want to read that little section or a portion of that.
I can. Can you talk a little bit about your piece at the back? Because that was one of the connections.
All right.
And when I first met you, you showed some slides of older pieces that had to do with water and spirits. And there was a connection to Haiti and to Vodou.
Right.
And when I just walked in, as I arrived here, as others have, I walked into the space and I saw all those mirrors, and the colors are actually pertinent to the current Haitian flag, but the blue, the red, but just the idea of the mirrors and being seen and not being seen, which is something that's going on in this novel too. Who sees, who doesn't see, who is seen, who is not seen.
Who becomes invisible.
Who becomes spirit.
Yeah. Well, I guess, this piece in particular is, which I'm calling Beckoning. It's been untitled for almost the entire show. But, and I think it was really, I've kind of worked a lot, dealing with this sort of, recognition that the spirit world and our ancestors are forever prevalent and amongst us. But I think, with COVID and this long separation and having lost many people, and then, I really felt that there was this sort of unfinished journey that, the deceased had come across. And I was like, how do we find our way back? And I think part of that comes from just personally, my aunt died, and, we had to have like a Zoom memorial, and my mother is just really has not been able to have any sort of closure over that, and, kind of how important those closure rituals are. And maybe that's how we might end with the closing of this tonight, if you can read a section from that. But, so I kind of created this figure that is, she's like Oya, she is who will lead you from this world to the next world. And there's many figures in many mythologies and many cultures that are basically those that take us from the world of the living to the world of the dead, and to kind of, help us find that space. And I felt like, again, that all these spirits are kind of roaming. And so these mirrors are here to kind of catch them, to attract them and to catch them. And then she can kind of then take them by the hand and lead them to the next place. And then also for us who are not able to let go of them, will also kind of give us closure as well. So that's what that piece is about in particular. And I'm part of my recognition of this sort of idea of mirrors as portals and light attracting spirits comes from art historian, cultural historian Robert Ferris Thompson, who we just lost 2 weeks ago. And so, the title of his book, Flash of the Spirit, was really looking at Haitian art and looking at the Veve flags and the Voodoo flags and stuff like that. And so I also wanted to mention, give thanks to him for all of the wisdom he's passed on. So,
yeah, I mean, in Vodou, we have a concept called Lokomirhua, and it is the ways of a mirror. And it's exactly what you're talking about, using the mirrors as a way to attract the spirits, sometimes also to repel certain kinds of spirits.
Right.
But, as you're speaking, I was thinking about, I started writing this novel in 2013, and in some ways, the person who galvanized my wanting to write it was a painter named Leroy Clark, who also passed away in July. And he's a very well-known Trinidadian painter who didn't know much about Haitian painting when I met him, but was in the middle of doing a series on Haiti, or to honor what had happened in 2010. And when I saw those paintings, I realized that as a writer, I had a responsibility to the dead to do something, in response to the earthquake, which was something I wasn't planning to do. But when I saw those paintings and he literally asked me to interpret them for him, I realized there was some skill, that I could bring as someone who's a literary critic, but also a novelist. And so I just think it's interesting that we have this back and forth with art and the word. And the other person for me who was very important to the novel is my mother, who passed away in 2019, and who was one of my first readers. And so for those of you who get the book, you'll find that it's dedicated not only to my mother, but also to the 250,000 to 300,000 people who perished in the earthquake. And so my way into Sarah from the things that you've said is that one of the things I've thought a lot about in writing this novel was how could I in some way impart to the reader a sense of all of those departed spirits and also those who are still persisting and are in a grieving process. I think for me, writing the novel was part of my grieving process, even as I lost my mother and one of her sisters also this spring. And it, it's been bittersweet to have a novel appear after their passings. And they were at least 3 people I know who were sort of waiting for the novel. But I also know that their spirits are here. But one of the reasons I had 10 narrative voices, and there were actually 13 main characters in the novel, and now there's 10 voices, and the 3, if you read the novel, you have to determine who the other 3 are, because 2 were cut and 1 never got his own narrative. And but part of the idea behind it was that each of those narrative voices might stand in for all of those individuals who are gone, who are not remembered because the whole family groups disappeared. And the way, those who died in the earthquake were initially miscounted is that the count was being done in terms of who survived to be able to tell who was gone. And so that didn't take into account those who didn't have any witnesses. And so in some ways, the novel is my attempt to bear witness, both to the dead and those who've survived. And of course, part of, I think there's a larger discussion among Haitian groups now and people related to Haiti because of the August 14th earthquake about the kinds of, we call it séquelles in French, but a kind of, the remains of those deaths or those, what was lost materially and personally in the 2010 earthquake has come back in 2021 because the August 14th earthquake was actually larger in magnitude, but not as large in terms of a death toll, simply because the area of the Southern Peninsula affected does not have as many people. But still, over 2,200 people perished, which for a modern earthquake is quite significant because normally we count in the hundreds. And the 2010 earthquake on the scale of earthquakes since, humanity is the largest since 1500. And so for both earthquakes to happen in Haiti is something. And so one of the things I tried to think through was what would it be like to be one of those survivors who, who has to continue to live. And a lot of us, I think, who are connected to Haiti have had conversations with people who were in the thick of it and lost loved ones, lost maybe their professions, and are in some ways suspended in time because of, I think for all of us, there's a sense of a before and an after the earthquake because there's nothing, Haiti has been through a lot historically, but nothing quite like this. And so Sarah, so in the novel, you'll find that the 10 narrative voices are from 3 distinct family groups, and they are all interconnected in different ways from the marketplace or through a profession or something like that. And Sarah is the mother of one of those groups, so she's a young mother, and she's lost 2 of her children immediately in the earthquake. And maybe when we get to the end of a conversation, I'll read from her surviving son's chapter. And this is I think Alison asked me to read from this part, and it has to do with a tugging that she feels. So she's, if we were to speak in psychological terms, she's going through clinical depression. But in the novel, she's simply telling you her version of surviving. And this has to do with water and spirits as well. Okay. Okay, I'll start here. At some point, the hands that had gotten her into the tent came back and shook her gently from sleep one morning to give her a washing down near the place where the women beat the clothes of dirt when water was scarce. Women's hands took the dress off her that had begun to stick to her skin. They had to cut her out of it and gave her something new to wear. Olivier would never recognize her. This is her husband who's left for another IDP camp. She panicked when they took her brassiere off and the piece of paper fell out. She screamed until the hands gave her back the piece of paper after she had been dried off and returned to the calm shade of her tent. She held the scrap of paper close to her until she fell asleep that day. She slept through the heat of the day in broad light. Did spirits prefer cleanliness? Had she known this? She had avoided washing and taking care in case her 3 tried to find their way back to her. She didn't want them back, not the way they were now, bloodied and broken, empty, lifeless vessels. She didn't want them back. She wanted everything back, everything. Olivier, where was he? The third time the thing came to tug at her at night, it did something that only she could recognize. It tickled at her feet. It was something the second had started doing when the girl was about 3 or 4, because the girl had learned the relationship between her mother's sensitive feet and bringing her out of bed and into the kitchen to fix breakfast. She startled when she felt the tickling, said, "Is that you, chérie? Is that you, dear?" Wide awake, looking around in the darkness. She wondered how she could be sure that it wasn't one of the orbs playing a trick on her. What if they were trying to get her to follow them into a world darker than this one, a world in which Olivier could never find her? Of course, she didn't know if Olivier was in the world from before, her world in between, or the world somewhere beyond with the orbs. She needed a way to be sure. She stayed awake all night, wondering what she could do to test the spirit, all the while talking to it in whispers in case it was the third child, her firstborn, the bloodied mass, still alive, taken away to have a crushed limb removed, returned to her in a shell of bandages and splints, come back to her seeking comfort. She'd taken care of him, lips and fingers trembling all the time, until he too had died a month later, his body thrown away with all the dead. She apologized for abandoning their bodies without ceremony. She felt a wave of heat flow over her from the side of a mattress. She imagined forgiveness because she couldn't imagine what a child's wrath might feel like. And hadn't it tickled her? No angry child would do that. In the morning, she decided to go look for bowls, water, salt. Didn't they say damned spirits clung to earth because they had ingested salt? A candle. Going to wash, finally? Someone sitting on a handmade bench in front of their tent said to her, matter-of-factly, thinking she was looking for salt as a replacement for soap, salt cleansed, purged, disinfected, not looking up to see the determined expression on her face. She was going to catch some ghosts or find her daughters, one or the other. She collected 6 small plastic bowls, the kind she might have used to feed cereal to the 3 in the morning while she watched on, amused at their earnestness while they ate, one for each of them and for her grandmother, who might be watching over them, her and the family, she thought, and a catch of fresh rainwater from Loko. Loko was collecting it in an oil drum he'd lidded with planks of wood shorn into a circle. The candle was for protection and for hope, whatever happened, whatever revealed itself in the dark, trying to tickle her feet or tug at her arm, whatever or whoever it was. It took all day. When she was ready, she set the bowls half filled with water around the circumference of the mattress. In 3, she placed a half teaspoon of salt. The malevolent ghost would play with the salt water, the others would seek the fresh water. Why she'd thought of water and salt, she wasn't sure. But if she thought about it, the tugging had started after the washing, sometime after that. There had to be some connection. It took her all day to prepare, to set the bowls in a half circle around the edges of the bed, to salt 3 of the 6 bowls. She repeated to herself the reasoning that malevolent ghosts would gravitate to salt and that the others, one of the girls, would seek the fresh. When she thought it was dark enough, she lit the candle, then laid herself down on the mattress and feigned sleep. Could they know if she was awake or not? She wanted to see what would come. Her mind raced, then quieted, then she listened to the ambient noises all around her. The camp buzzed like a market at high noon. She heard the slap of dominoes against a plank some men had set across their knees for a table. Animal grunts, the flap of fowl wings, babies crying, mothers cooing, smelled the stink of rotting flesh, fruit, animal, or human. She couldn't distinguish anymore. She fell asleep. Then the tug at her arm came, then the tickling at her feet. She woke, opened her eyes slowly, saw her, the little girl, one of hers. She smiled for the first time since this purgatory had begun. The girl was dipping her hands in and out of the water bowls, both the salt and the fresh. What did this mean? She shrugged to herself. Maybe nothing mattered. The old sayings couldn't mean anything since the world had broken in two before the event and after the event. She saw a shape moving, not the whole girl. Is that you, she asked. Is it you? There were giggles in answers, then small translucent hands dipping into the bowls. She looked twice. There was not one, but two pairs of hands, going in and out of the water, upsetting the bowls, spilling the water. There would be salt marks in the morning, in the dirt, staining the mat around its edges. Proof, too. The girls, there too? Where was Olivier? Her grandmother was not there. Where was she? She had not seen or heard her for so many years, had not thought of her or laid a glass of fresh water before her picture frame in the house on the altar for the ancestors. Two pairs of hands of different sides, shades of brown, hands she knew like her own, the two come back to her. If there was another, she refused to see him, for she could feel him for the first time since he had disappeared some 6 weeks after dues.
Yeah, so you all can understand how that passage just haunted me for what I thought was 4 years, but more like 6 years. Just really powerful. And I love that that just the hands of the women that are helping her are not distinguished from the hands of her deceased children, and that she's in this realm where she cannot distinguish these two worlds. And it feels like she's setting this trap to find her children. But it is also sort of a test to her own sort of, I don't want to say her mortality, but her own place in this world. And it's interesting because you hear that, and she's very rational in this section, that she understands what she's doing, and it all has a real perfect reason. But when you hear this narrative, as they overlap all the different voices, and you hear other people, and some understand that it's just grief, and some question whether it's madness.
Right.
And so I think it's just really beautiful how, again, how these characters are seeing each other and telling each other's stories from these different vantage points.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's the first time I've heard somebody say that they thought Sarah was rational, which is interesting, because she is telling her narrative in a way that makes logical sense. Mm-hmm. And I think part of the writing of Sarah was to give grief that kind of shape, that even being in the depths of grief doesn't mean that it's irrational, right? But it makes some sense. But she's also trying to make sense of rituals which she can't quite completely remember, and she's trying to come up with a new ritual. And so I think the idea was also to honor the ways in which people are surviving in ways that I think only in a Haitian space or Caribbean space will seem completely normal,
right?
As opposed to somebody losing their sense of the real, But in Haiti, the spirit world is real, as we know many parts of the diaspora, in the Americas too here, as you're invoking Flash of the Spirit, But there is this sense in which the African knowledge of the spirits always being with us and among us is also being honored in that moment where she's, seeing that her children might be coming back to her, maybe they're not all gone. And so I think another dimension of a novel is to make the dead appear as real as those who,
the other characters.
We think are alive, so that sometimes you're not quite sure who might be dead or who's alive.
Right. And which is what they were experiencing, because nobody knew
Absolutely.
for so long. And,
and also,
still, the remains haven't even all been identified. So.
And will never be.
Yeah,
I mean, some are just paved over, basically. But I was also thinking of an uncle of mine who's also passed since, but was one of the people who, buried the dead, because one of the family businesses in my family, my father's family, is is to bury the dead, you know. So that's one of the things he was doing. And I remember my father telling him that he needed to leave Haiti, get some rest, and he left. He went to Miami and was back in Haiti within, I think, 4 or 5 days. And everyone was shocked and asked, you know, why would you go back to? And this was very early days, maybe February, March after the earthquake. And he said, because when I'm in Port-au-Prince, nobody is surprised if, you know, there's a loud noise and I jump, or, you know, if I start crying, because his mother had died in the earthquake as well. It's normal. You know, people just greet you and you go on your way. And so there's something to be said for coping mechanisms that we might not accept in another space, but allow somebody to go forward.
Right. I also really appreciate the way this book really talks about the earthquakes in a way that us have not really understood through the media, because the media was always about all the saviors outside of Haiti and all, you know, the Red Cross. And of course we know that, you know, they also brought diseases with them and created a whole other chaos and horrible thing. But I love that it just feels like it's very much about these people, about Haitians telling their own history and their own story, and that it's not, you know, the names are on the, you know, and it's even kind of saying, you know, how, you know, inadequate that assistance was. And, you know, their name is printed big on everything, so you know exactly where that dime came from. But, you know, no real understanding of what these people really need. And it's just really, really such an incredible opportunity to really understand that history a little deeper.
Thank you. Yeah.
I don't know, are you up for a couple more? One character that I was really interested, who you alluded to momentarily, is Saar's son, Jonas. And he is constantly, well, you'll see, counting, but you know, and also you mentioned sort of Haiti's long history and really long troubled history, that it's had so many, you know, for a country that, you know, was, you know, Toussaint Louverture and, you know, kind of, you know, liberating themselves, you know, kind of simultaneously with the French Revolution, and being, you know, this stellar beginning, and how, you know, in some ways I wondered that was also, you know, that the rest of the world turned its back on this country in a weird sort of way and kind of was never there for them. But yeah, just to kind of think of all those histories and, you know, kind of going forward and coming back, and that kind of, for some reason, that really resonated with the way Jonas tells his story.
Yeah, I think I can bridge, I can do a quick reading from Olivier and then end with Jonas.
Okay.
Because I think it connects. So Olivier, you heard Sarah sort of talking about where her husband might be, and Olivier's her husband, and he's left her with her third child to go to another camp. So one of the things that happened after the earthquake is that there was an attempt to decentralize Port-au-Prince by creating camps outside of the capital with a promise of factories being built there and factory work coming. And so at least 5,000 people were displaced from one of the largest camps into this desert area. And Olivier goes there partly to escape his grief, but partly because of his promise. And he's an accountant, and so was Sarah. You know, they were both accountants. And so one of the things that I do in the novels, as I mentioned before, is have people from different socioeconomic backgrounds. And there's a millionaire, Olivier, who is the son of Malou, but has turned his back on Haiti and doesn't take care of her, although he does finance the education of his natural daughter, Anne, who's also one of the narrative voices. But Olivier is somebody who, in some ways, is a counterpoint to this millionaire, where, you know, he's ostensibly lower middle class, has a profession, has not experienced a lot of loss in his life, and this is the first big catastrophe that he's had to face. But the reason I want to read from him is that he speaks to this legacy that you're talking about, where a lot of people only know Haiti because of a revolution, and don't know a lot about Haiti today. And so he's a numbers person, so he's calculating the numbers as the millions are coming into Haiti shortly after the earthquake. And then Jonas, who is turning 11 after the beginning of the year, in early January, but before the earthquake, could be described as being on the spectrum. You know, he has habits, but they're all numerical. And so you'll see the connection between the two. I'll read a very short section from Jonas, from Olivier, and then I'll read a slightly longer from Jonas. And the thing to know about Olivier is that he's really angry. And hopefully I'm going to read from a section where he doesn't swear, but you can look forward to that. So he says, it's been less than 3 months, and there's been a mad dash for pledges from what they call the international community. What community there is, I don't know. Millions from Cuba, Venezuela, Brazil, God knows from where. Hundreds of millions, thousands of millions, maybe trillions. Unbelievable that it took this, an earthquake, to open the coffers, abracadabra. Imagine if every single Haitian who lost someone could get their hands on some of that money, decide what they needed for themselves, their family. You could create a healthy working middle class, and still there would be millions amassing in a treasure trove behind them. But of course, they won't allow that to happen. They tell us first that we need to learn our lesson. Death by hunger isn't enough. Then that we need to build better infrastructure. Then that we need to unlearn our corrupt ways, stop killing each other, have fewer dreams for our children, because everyone knows that we are dreamless people. Be good factory workers so that those who are already millionaires can become billionaires, and billionaires can become zillionaires. In short, aspire down, not up. A people who know what to do with nothing will know what to do with plenty, is my thinking. You can be sure of that. I only have to look at all the Madame Sarah at the sides of the roads and in the markets. I know they have a stash somewhere. After they pack up at the end of the day, the vast majority of them have a little cabane to go home to. They lay their heads down. They might even make enough to pay another woman a little something to clean while they're away, send the children to school, and greet the children when they return. Have a pot of bone soup waiting on the stove. Ah, women like Malou, they know how to pinch pennies, spread the wealth. You raised us, paid for our uniforms and school books, dusted us off when we fell, taught us our prayers, taught us how to tell the devil to fuck the hell off when we needed to, because the devil isn't always an enemy. Showed us how to turn pennies into good and good into dollar. Ah, the almighty American dollar. You women know. You taught us. You could turn this whole goddamn place around, bring us into the black, literally, and take no shit while turning the evildoers out of the market. And I'll finish from Jonas. Jonas was actually the first character who came to me when I decided to write this novel, and he's mostly as he was when I started. So he's an interesting character to have to let go of. And as we were talking earlier, as you'll find out, he is between worlds, once of this world and now eternally of it. Jonas, Port-au-Prince, Haïti. 12. It's the number of days that passed since the first of the year and the earth trembled, only half of which I was finally old enough to blow out my candles. 12, divided in half, is the number of candles Mama put on my cake, short 5 wicks for my real age, because that was what she could borrow from the neighbor woman whose children had all left her years before and never came home. The number of cell phones they could have bought her by now, the number of eggs that sit in an open carton on Malou's stand at the market, which takes 48 steps to reach if you forge through the crowd like a chicken looking for her babies, hoping not to be snatched up off the ground to be fried for someone's dinner at night. The number of eggs we wonder at with wide open eyes but can buy only 2 or 3 of at a time if there's money in the house that week, or if not, that we can only gaze at from a distance while Malou makes us scatter away so she can deal with real customers, the ones who come down in their cars and never even put a foot out to touch the dust, who look out onto the market stalls from their perches and squawk at their drivers to get this and that, inspecting the whole dozen of eggs before purchasing it, while Malou yells, "Pas mangez them," don't touch my eggs. "Pas casser them," don't break my eggs. Ou toucher, ou acheter. You touch, you buy. Dollar, pas cob, We all know they have houses in Miami and Montreal, those people. 12. The number of ears of corn the crazy man who thought he was a cob had eaten after he was cured, then choked, thinking, I know I'm not a cob, but what if the chickens don't know? Papa told me that joke. -2. It's the number of friends from school I can count on my hands, the number of first cousins on my mother's side, the number of seconds I can hold my breath at the dinner table before Papa slaps me gently across the back of my head to get me to stop, and I burst into laughter. Mama says he worries after us like a woman, but like a man, he doesn't talk much, uses his hands instead. ×2, the number of seconds I can swim underwater before coming up for air, watching the little school of fish with yellow bellies dart between my body and the distant pointy pokes of pinkish coral reef stuck below at the bottom of the ocean. It's the number of pieces of blue mint candy I took from the dish in the hotel lobby that morning after running an errand for Malou and Sonia, the niece of a neighbor whose television I watch sometimes after school and gave to the girl in my class I have my heart set on once I got to school, all sweaty and tired from the morning run. The number of times that girl's older brother got shot at when one of his deals went wrong in an alleyway, but none of the shots landed on him, and he laughed and laughed and laughed before his girlfriend left him, saying she didn't want to hear that laugh again. It's the number of blocks between the house and the school with all their hiding places and shadows, the largest number of points on a domino tile, the number of times my mother prays the rosary before she goes to sleep, round and round again, the coral beads dangling across the mapu brown of her fingers, +2. The number of stations of a cross at church, the number of times the little Jesus had to pay for our lives, the number of little thorns I imagined dug deep into the flesh of his scalp and made him bleed before he realized that no one was coming to save him. 12 seconds is all the time it took for the length of wall separating the living room from the bedrooms in the neighbor's house where we all gathered, frozen in front of a TV, sitting or standing, watching the late afternoon soap opera, to fall, while I traced a vine-like crack climbing speedily across its surface. I wasn't supposed to be there, warming the one egg that I had gotten from Malu's stall, running an errand after school for Mama, who was waiting for me in our kitchen, where she was making something for us to eat. The girls were there, sitting on the tile floor, playing, then disappeared into the ground. It's the number of times I cried out for Mama until I realized that she couldn't hear me, for all the other children crying out for their mamas, both in the neighbor's house and out in the street, everyone crying out for their mamas as if each were the same person, reaching for my little sisters only to find air in my hand, grasping then hours of hearing them crying together, only for their cries to go silent after a while they pinned beneath cement blocks, not knowing what to do, frightened.
In some ways, that character feels almost like a puck or something that really sort of, in that kinetic description, you really take in all of Haiti in a really interesting way, that there's this sort of, he's, all that he's seeing, that he's observing much like Malou, but just really, it says it in such a way that really sets, a painting. It's like a painting of Haiti in a really fantastic way.
Yeah, I had one person in another talk, somebody asked me if I would develop some of the other characters, minor characters, and I was really surprised that some readers are interested in characters that have really, really minor roles in the story. And then I realized just what you said, which is that in a way, without knowing it, given that I was inspired by a painter, that the novel is kind of like a painting, because even the least sort of fleshed out character has a life, that you want to know more about, and that's what a lot of Haitian paintings, especially market paintings, are
Right,
like,
right.
where there's
With
always
all the
something in the corner. There's
little
always something
tiny
going on.
things,
Yeah.
right? You can
little
see the
bird
little
flapping,
eggs.
you know,
Yeah.
who's doing what over there. So yeah, hopefully it gives you a sense of all of Haiti and its multiplicity.
Well, hopefully this all will make you guys, those who haven't already read the book, grab one and read it. It's obviously a phenomenal piece, and it
Thank
made
you.
like all these incredible lists.
It made a lot of lists. I'm very thankful.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
really, really
Out of
fantastic.
your endless.
Do we have a moment for some questions, or was there anything else you wanted to
I can
read?
take questions, sure.
We have a moment for questions, but we have no microphones. So if you must project
Should we
your
run?
question so that everyone can hear it, and we can put it on be recorded as well.
You want to take one of these?
So give up one.
Oh, do you want to take this one? Lisa, take this one, and then I can hold that one.
I could hold this one. Okay.
Okay, we'll bring it back.
Here, you're going to be
Okay, I'll take this one.
Question?
Just a really simple question. So if you were to develop any minor character in the book, which minor character would it have been?
It's a great question, and actually I wouldn't, because for me this is a project that I lived with for so many years, and then further refined with my editors, and so I feel like this is exactly what each of these characters wants to say. And I also hope that if in hearing them and if in reading them, you feel that they are symbolic of real individuals in Haiti on the ground, then I have done my job. If they feel real to you, then I don't need to write a sequel or have an afterlife. Having said that, there is at least one character who has an afterlife from the novel, because as I said, 2 characters were cut in the editorial process. And that character is Loko. And Loko told the story. So Loko, you hear his name when I read the Sarah section. He takes care of Sarah in the camp, and he's an old man. And he takes care of her partly because he's a kind person, but partly because she reminds him of his daughter. So there was a backstory of his departure from La Gonave, which is the island at the mouth of Port-au-Prince. It faces Port-au-Prince. So there was that backstory, and my editors felt that it was too far removed from the earthquake to belong in the novel. But a piece of it has been published in a book called, I think it's called Une soirée haïtienne, a Haitian evening, published with Sidika in Montreal. And a longer English version is going to appear with, I think it's Room magazine in Vancouver. And so there is an afterlife, but I won't be writing more of the characters. Thank you for the question.
Any other questions? Oh, we'd like to record you, actually.
This is the spirit of my dad asking this. Who's your favorite author?
My favorite author?
Yeah, that's what he would ask. That's what my dad would ask.
That's a tough one because I'm a literature professor, so that's like asking me to and this is being recorded. So how about I say I can tell you who I come back to a lot or who has been a sort of guiding writerly presence, and that would be James Baldwin, hands down for me, who I read as a teenager and have not stopped rereading and teaching. I teach a Baldwin seminar at Scripps, across the 5C colleges. And I wrote my master's on him, so he definitely was somebody who inspired me to believe that the written word could make a difference no matter how you decided to work in different genres. And remembering, because I remember as a scholar learning that in his time he was a best-selling author, but he was derided by critics. And even to this day, a lot of people who work in American lit consider his novels failed, but that he's one of the best essayists that America, modern essayists. And I would dispute that. I think that he was doing things that were ahead of his time, that only now people are coming back to an understanding. Toni Morrison, of course, would be another person, not only for the content, but the ways in which she really wrestled with the written word. I remember reading one of her later books. If you read Paradise and later books like Love, I think the mastery over language is unequaled. I mean, she is, in a playpen by herself, And then I would want to mention some Haitian authors that I think other people should know more about. Yannick Laens is one who has been recently translated. She won the Prix Féminin in France, which is one of their biggest literary awards. Moonbath is the translated novel that won that award. And then the other person I'm reading a lot of is Émilie Prophète. So Prophète with an E, like prophet. And she has a book forthcoming in English translation in January called Blue. But she is really, I think, somebody you'll hear more about as we go forward. But yes, I'll just mention those names.
So thank you for a wonderful talk. So I'm just curious about the characters and how they came to you. Was that also a process of connecting with spirit, or inspired by, people that you know or connected with?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So the 3 years prior to my starting to write the novel, I gave a lot of talks. They were academic talks, they were best practices talks, but mostly for academic intellectual circles. And it's because I wrote the first book on Haitian women's literature, so I was known as a specialist on Haitian women and vulnerable communities. And so I was giving a lot of talks about best practices, what was happening on the ground, and I was in touch with people like Beverly Bell, who was there, documenting what was happening. She wrote a great book that I would recommend called Fault Lines, which is really more of a, on the ground, speaking to every person kind of account of the earthquake. And after I gave those talks, there would always be people in the audience who would come and talk to me and tell me about, themselves leaving Haiti after the earthquake or who they had lost. And there was a kind of process of commiseration that would go on. But at the time, I didn't think about why that was happening, why I was receiving these stories. And so the reason being in Leroy Clark's studio was so important is that he had been, since after the earthquake, painting feverishly into the night, deep into the night. And when I met him, this would have been in 2012, it would have been 2013, because I started writing in 2013. He laid out all the paintings, and at the time there were 77, and he literally did not know what he was painting, So he came up to me and asked me, he said, what are they saying? What are they saying? And my understanding at the time was that he was in communication with, you could call it inspiration, or you could call it visitation, that he was being visited by the spirits, and he was doing his best to translate what he was feeling on the canvas. And so I wrote him a letter, I remember, in the space, the messages I was receiving. And then, for any of you who know anything about divination, one of the things that you learn in that path is that whenever you give a message, there's a message for the person who is providing the message. And so I went home from that trip, and I sat down, and I started thinking, why was I telling Leroy, who in his field is a giant, what his paintings meant? And why was I telling him about the spirits? And I was weeping in his gallery, as this was going on. And I sat down and I realized that people had been coming to me for those last 3 years with a message that, like if they had been going to a party and saw a physician and said, I have this ache or pain, they were coming to me as a writer and saying, you have a responsibility. This is why I'm talking to you, because you have something to do. And so I literally, this was a Thursday after this trip, I came home at the beginning of the week. On the Thursday of that week, it just dawned on me that I was supposed to write the novel, and all the characters just came to me in that sitting. I didn't necessarily have all their names, but I knew I had a market woman, I knew I had a child, I knew I had a trafficker, I knew I had a millionaire. I knew who they were, approximately what age they were, and then it took years to find, I wouldn't say years, because Jonas came like that, like the voice you heard today just came speaking to me. And then I moved through the characters, trying to really capture in the same way that Leroy was trying to listen and paint. It was a listening. So in that sense, none of the characters are, the result of anybody's specific story that was told to me. By the time I wrote, I had so much accumulated knowledge, from my colleagues who are NGO workers or people like Bev, who were writing about it and disseminating information. And I was giving so many talks, gathering information from all the sources I could find. And then I was hearing people's grief, really, is what I was hearing. And I was carrying my own. So then when the characters came to me, they may have been sometimes inspired. So for example, many of you would know that the Hotel Montana fell, which was a resort hotel in the mountains that housed NGO workers and people from the UN. The survivors we heard about were only NGO workers and UN workers. And when I traveled with my last novel, Loneliness of Angels, was in a hotel where a worker came up to me and asked me if I was Haitian. And I said yes, and said, well, I survived the fall of the Hotel Montana. And I said, oh, okay. And he walked away. And I never got more from that story. But that because he was a worker in that hotel, I remember thinking, what do we know of the workers in the Montana? What do we know of who was there, who was local? And that's how Sonia, who is a sex worker in the hotel, became part of my story. Dieudonné, her best friend, both of whom are queer identified. And then a third character, Leopold, who is Trinidadian and finds himself in Haiti and is one of the wealthier people in that resort. That all came from just that one person saying, I survived. And then as a writer, asking the next question, what story don't I know? What story don't readers know? What story can I tell? And then those three characters were born of asking those questions. So it's partly inspiration, but again, also visitation, because I feel like people like Sarah, that I read from, really just came to me, very clearly with how they wanted to convey their grief and their process. Thank you for your question.
It was kind of interesting because when I was initially reading it, I was thinking, what a colossal amount of research you must have done. But to know that these stories came to you and that you were functioning almost like a griot, and kind of just filtering that and putting it in a cognitive sort of narrative thing, which also makes why they're so visceral and so alive. So it's really interesting to hear that process.
I think there had to be some follow-up research.
Sorry.
That's okay. Follow-up research in terms of details. So, for example, Jonas came to me the way he was speaking with the numbers and calculating. But then when I went back to him in the revision process, I needed to do this will give away a little bit of his storyline for people, I apologize. But you've already heard that he had the crushed limb. And one of the problems after the earthquake was, crushed limb survivors or people who had to get what's called cigar cut amputations, many of which immediately in the wake of the earthquake were performed by military personnel who were not NGO workers or, relief workers. And what happened in many cases is that because it was done without proper anesthesia, many people did not go for return, because when you get a cigar cut amputation, you need to get recut for prosthesis. So you have to go through another surgical process. And so many people didn't return. And we don't have numbers on those individuals, but what is thought is that many people died of gangrene from from having improper care. So I knew that bit, but I didn't know, what would be the aftercare for somebody who had a cigar cut amputation. So then I had to go back into Jonas and Sonia and Olivier, his parents' stories, giving more information about what the protocol is and then why he would have had a gangrene. So there was another kind of research that had to come back in, after all the flooding in and the writing through.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for coming. Thank you. Thank you so much for supporting Focal.